But that's the story of Zoom. Hopefully, I mean, it is possible that we are approaching the end of the Zoom era. So for today, I want to teach something which is somewhat Kabbalistic. It's very, very interesting. On one hand, it's Kabbalistic, but it's very foundational in Judaism and in life, I would say. For me, it's something I definitely think about a lot. But this last couple weeks, Parshas, we were talking about the Mishkan, the tabernacle. Now, in previous years, I had extensively gone through the Mishkan and kind of given a tour of the tabernacle, but it's kind of difficult, on Zoom, and we've done it so many years. But the Torah speaks about the tabernacle in 3 portions. And then we take a break. Yesterday, we read about the golden calf. And then we read about the tabernacle for 2 more portions, and we actually repeat the story of the tabernacle. It's actually repeated. Now, that's very unusual in the Torah. We know in the Torah that most things aren't repeated. In fact, most things are measured very, very carefully. But here with the tabernacle, we repeat it. The first time is God telling it to Moses, and the second time is Moses telling it to the Jewish people. Now the tabernacle, I just want to mention, so this is being on YouTube, but I'm the only one who can be seen on it. And I don't usually share it. I share it to 1 or 2 people. I don't like publicize it. Just there were a couple of people who asked me to give them my weekly class. So in the tabernacle, we find that the tabernacle was given an atonement for the golden calf. So when the Jewish people sinned, God's presence left them. So to atone that, God said, build the tabernacle, and I will rest in it. The Torah, it's a very dear mitzvah in the Torah. That is where, if you can imagine, our matrimony with God takes place in the tabernacle. It's God's revealed presence in the world. Of course, we know that God is everywhere, but in some places he's hidden. We don't always see God. In the tabernacle, that is a place where God comes into the world. In the early era, he would actually manifest in a physical fire. A fire would come down from heaven and burn the sacrifices. But as Jews became less deserving, it didn't happen. But and the same goes with the Temple Mount. The Temple Mount in Jerusalem is still where God, so to speak, kisses the world in a revealed way, and that spreads to the whole world. That's why it's such a holy site. So just to mention the tabernacle, it's repeated twice in the Torah. I said this before. We find that the things which are repeated twice are really, really dear to God. We have another story about the shidduch of Isaac at the beginning of the Torah, very dear to God. The story is repeated twice in the Torah. And here also, this story is repeated twice. We go through the building of the tabernacle. In theory, God's telling Moses the instructions. And then we have the actual building happening. The actual building actually teaches a very strong lesson. Ma'aseh hu ha'ikar. Action is the most important thing in Judaism. For the person, sometimes thought, emotions may feel more important. But in the big picture for God, action is the most important thing you can do. So that's always, important when it came to putting on tefillin or anything like that. The thought and emotion and meditational parts of Judaism are very important, but the purpose of them is action. So the Mishkan, we have one part where God tells Moses, and the second part, they actually build it, right? Action is done. Action is a lot of times the most difficult thing. I mean, look at the government. They talk the whole day what they're going to do, right? But the actual action implementing is always very difficult. So here's what we're going to talk about. This is a Kabbalistic teaching that I happened to come by. The Rebbe's father was a great Kabbalist, and his teachings are mind-boggling. They're out of this world. He was an incredible genius, and you can see it somewhat in his teachings. There's a rabbi who I know of. He kind of sometimes takes a teaching and breaks it down. And so I'm going to break down a teaching that he taught from the Rebbe's father. He's the Chabad rabbi in Princeton, not in the campus, but in the city. I'm going to break it down even more and make it understandable, and we'll see a really deep message that we can find. So I'm going to share a screen, and we're going to do this. We're going to do this together. Now, what's really important is nowadays when we don't have a tabernacle, it's very important to make our homes a tabernacle. That's what we do nowadays. And everyone see this picture over here?
Yep.
Okay, if you don't see it, it's okay. But this is the image of the tabernacle. It looks like they took it with a drone, right? It looks like they took it with a drone back then. But I'm not sure if they had drones. So this is a graphic design, right? It's actually a really nice one. It's nice in my childhood seeing them improve the design as time goes on. It used to be like really choppy. So here you have the tabernacle. You have the sanctuary inside. Inside here, you got the menorah, the altar, the ark, right? A small altar for incense. Then you have the big altar outside. This was for animals. And then you have this area here, which is really the courtyard. And then around this area, as you can see, there are like these walls and screens going all the way around, mesh screen going all the way around. And that's what the parshas this week and describe. It's a double parsha, actually the longest parsha. I'll just tell you a funny anecdote. Until exactly last year, we had a minyan going for almost a whole year. Every Shabbos we had a minyan. We read the Torah. You guys remember, right? Anyways, the first year I made a minyan, we didn't have a minyan most weeks. And then the second year we had a minyan almost every week. And I said, what's the divine providence in this? I told my wife. I said, the first year people were starting out. If we would have read the Torah every week, people would have gotten bored and said, this is too long. This is crazy. So the first year we didn't have a minyan, so it was a little shorter. And then we went through 1 year, and then another year we had a minyan every week. And then last year we were having a minyan, and I told my wife, I said, 2 years ago was not a double parsha, so it wasn't so long. But this year it's a double parsha. It's the longest parsha of the year. I said, I don't know how people are going to survive. Until now, I always tell them, okay, it's going to take us 20 minutes, well, 10 minutes left, right? And we drag out, right? But how are people going to survive? Anyways, it's exactly this week. We didn't have a minyan last year because of COVID. And, we actually had a minyan last week, not this past Shabbos, but 2 weeks ago, the Shabbos before Purim. Hopefully we're getting back there. We also have the opportunity, the weather's getting better, so we can almost start doing things outside a little bit more. But anyways, the Torah repeats everything that we studied a few weeks ago in a very long portion. And what we're going to focus on is we can look over here. The verses say that this screen that created the courtyard around the tabernacle, this is the tabernacle, this is the courtyard, is 100, right? 15 is 30, and then 50 wide. And obviously you could do arithmetic. How wide was this little door? Let's see, any engineers in the house? You could figure it out. It's not too hard. Right, so if this is 50 and this is 15 and 15, this is going to be 20, right? 30 plus 20 equals 50. All right, so anyways, these are amot. Amma is a biblical measure. How big is an amma? Amma is sometimes 5 handbreadths, sometimes 6 handbreadths. Amma literally means the measurement from your elbow to the end of your fingers of the average person. It was roughly a foot and a half. Roughly a foot and a half. The amma, sorry about that. It was roughly a foot and a half. And so therefore this would be around 150 feet. This would be around 75 feet, right? And then 30 would be around 45 feet. This 15 here, 15 here, right? Now, in the olden days, they had a ruler in the front of the temple, which was a foot and a half, to know exactly how big an amma is, because these are biblical. It's a little bit more than a foot and a half. I mean, to the 10th of an inch. Anyone who comes here the Shabbat before Rosh Chodesh, they know that we calculate the new moon. We always say it's going to be Tuesday night, 4 o'clock, 36 minutes and 2 seconds, right? So we always, so here's what the Torah says. It says, Vayas ha'chatzar lifas negev temana kali ha'chatzar sheish masar mea amma. He made the enclosure on the south side, 100 cubits of hangings of fine twisted linen for the enclosure. On the north side, 100 cubits. On the west side, 50. And on the front side, 50, right? 15 cubits of hanging on the one flank and 15 cubits hanging on the other flank, each side of the gate of the enclosure. So if you add that together, right, you get 100 plus 100 is 200. 50 is 250. And then this is like the doorway here. There's a little thing blocking the doorway, but you got 15, 30 equals 280. So I'm not going to go into too much about an amma is 1.5 feet approximately. So it equals 280. So what is the significance? This is what the Rebbe's father, Rabbi Levi Yitzchak, asks. He says, what is the significance of 280 cubits. 280. What's the significance of 280? Anyone want to take a guess? Okay. So let me just, what?
Multiple of high.
Multiple of chai. You know, maybe on Purim, it's a multiple of chai. If you drink too much. Right? Multiple of chai, no, because I 18 doesn't go into 280 evenly, I believe. So let's let me just show you, but that's close. Let me just show you before we start, something very important, which is a really big foundation in Judaism. But I'm going to give you a hint. If you look at all these Hebrew letters here, they each have a numerical value, right? But besides that, you have all these Hebrew letters. Now, if you look, there are 5 letters which have what they call a end letter. In Yiddish, they called it a Leinge letter or a Schluss letter. In Hebrew, they call it a sofit, right? A sof letter, an end letter. We have chaf, mem, nun, pei, and tzadik, right? Those are all the end letters. It actually spells out minatzpach, right? These are all the end letters. Minatzpach is mem, nun, tzadik, pei, chaf, right? And these are the actual end letters. There's 5 letters, the end letters. And that's what we're going to talk about, those end letters. And if you add up the numerical value of the end letters, let's do it. Mem is 40, nun is 50, right? So that's 90. Tzadik is 90, right? So you have 180, and then pei is 80, and chaf is 20, so that's 280. Those letters actually equal 280. It's the same amount. So somehow, and that's what we're going to mention, somehow the measurement of the Mishkan fence around the Mishkan is equivalent to the final letters, the Minatzpach letters. Right? You got that? Okay, so that's how somehow equivalent. Now, what's the connection? You can't just make a numerical value and not have any more internal connection because numbers can be very superficial. So we're going to talk about that today. But before we talk about it, we're going to talk about different letters, how letters work, why letters are so important in Judaism. And then we will talk about the end letters, the final letters, what they represent, and then we will tie it together. So here we go. So here you have the final letters, minatzpach. Now, minatzpach, the final letters, it says actually that the prophets revealed them. They were Jewish tradition, but the Hebrew language has a very interesting history in Jewish tradition. If you go to a lot of archaeological places, they will tell you that, I'll stop sharing this a little bit. They will tell you that the Hebrew language is relatively new. There's older languages than the Hebrew language. It would be considered scientifically like caveman language, you have each letter representing a symbol, right? I saw a comic somewhere where there was someone writing hieroglyphics and the teacher tells the student, you never end a sentence with a bird. They draw a little bird at the end of their sentence in the hieroglyphics. So in Judaism, this is what we believe. This is the Jewish tradition, and it's actually a very fascinating history. There are 2 types of Hebrew letters. When you go to Israel and they find an archaeological coin or object, and they say, oh my God, King David wrote this, or oh my gosh, this is from the era of Isaiah the prophet. It's in Hebrew. And you look at it for a second, and you say, what? That's not Hebrew. That's a bunch of triangles, right? That's a bunch of triangles. It's actually interesting. In New Mexico, Las Olas, New Mexico, they have a famous Decalogue. It's something you can go visit, and it's very interesting history. It's a rock, a big stone, which has engraved in it the 10 Commandments. And it's very, very ancient, very old. They found it in the 1800s, and scientists did not know, archaeologists did not know that was ancient Hebrew. So they couldn't figure out, maybe it's Indians or whatever it is. Only once in the 40s, when there were experts in the ancient Hebrew writing, they came and said, hey, that's the 10 Commandments. You can look at it online, the Decalogue of Las Olas, New Mexico. You can go there and visit it. I actually have met locals here who went there and visited it. It's a very interesting mystery where these Hebrew letters came, pre-Columbus Hebrew letters. But anyways, what exactly is going on with these triangles? So the answer is there are 2 types of letters. There are letters which are godly. Those are called the Ashuri letters. Those are the letters which you find in the Torah. The shapes of the letters you find in the Torah are very holy. They're God's script. They existed pre the world, pre the creation of the universe. Those are God's letters. Then you have letters which are in Hebrew are called Heskemi. They are agreed upon letters. What does agreed upon letters mean? Let's say I want to communicate in a language. I say, okay, let's communicate in Morse code, right? So I'll say to you, okay, did it, we'll work on a common language, a common way of expressing ourselves. So the letters which Jewish people used for many years were not the divine letters, which came pre the world, God's letters. Rather, the shapes of those letters were the letters that people agreed upon. So actually, when you look at like in Israel, there was a lot of difficulty making a language out of the Hebrew letters that they did when they created the state of Israel. There was a lot of difficulty there because a lot of people said these are divine letters, which are God's letters. Throughout Jewish history, people spoke in Aramaic, right? And they wrote in non-divine Hebrew letters, right? And if you know, Rochelle, you probably know how to write script, right? You do. So script, right? They're non-divine letters, right? They're non-divine. They're not God's ways of writing letters. People didn't want to use God's way of writing letters because those were super holy. When it comes to the 10 Commandments, actually, there are opinions that say that the first of the 10 Commandments were in the letters that we have in the Torah. The second ones that Moses wrote were in script. Moses says, oh boy, I don't write those letters, right? So this is a very interesting subject about the divine letters. Now, why is it so important for God to have a language before he created the world? I mean, who did he speak to after all? Right? There was no one to talk to. Why does he have a language? Why does he have letters? He already created a script, he already created letters, and he already created a language. Why was this a necessity for God? So here we're going to read an excerpt from the Tanya. If you like philosophy, this is a really wonderful philosophical part of the Tanya. It's the second book of the Tanya. It's a very, very fascinating. I mean, in yeshiva, I always loved it. I remember actually when I was in yeshiva, there was a brilliant professor in UCLA, And one of the rabbis in yeshiva came to me and he said, he's truly, truly brilliant. And his thesis is on Orthodox Judaism in LA. So he's coming to my synagogue to pretend he's an Orthodox Jew for about a year or two in order to try and really get an inside look at Orthodox Judaism. So he asked me, he said, would you study with this professor? So I studied with him, and this is actually what we studied. I said, okay, you want to study something very deep. And I lost touch with him, but actually he became a professor in the New School of New York. Phyllis, Jerry, you know about that school, right?
I've heard about it.
Yeah, it's a really good one. But someone told me from there, I kind of kept track, and someone told me that there was someone saying that there was something, I guess, I don't know, socially wrong with Judaism or racist or whatever it is. And he actually defended it because he said, oh, I studied, I know the Orthodox Jews from an inside place. But anyways, here's what it said. Here's what this says. And I'm taking it out of context a little bit just because I want to study this part. The Torah says, now we know that the world was created. How did God create the world? Does anyone know how God created it?
When he created it?
Yeah, how he created it.
He spoke. He spoke it.
He spoke it. He spoke it.
Yeah.
So the Torah tells us, God said, let there be light, right? Let there be this, let there be that. He spoke it. Now, usually talk is hot air, right? For most people. If I say, let there be this, let there be that, let there be money, it doesn't happen, right?
There you go.
But God's talk was able to create. God's talk is unique. God, he's different than us. His talk actually created the physical world. So here's what the Pirkei Avot said. It says, Basaram amarot nivra olam. God said 10 utterances and he created the world, right? He said 10 utterances and created the world. Now, the thing is, Jerry will ask a question. God created more than 10 things, right? So what does it mean, the 10 utterances? So here's what we're going to explain, how God did it in 10 utterances. And actually, how did God how do we work back? How did God create Jerry from his 10 utterances? I don't. How did Jerry come about with these 10 utterances that God started? So here's a teaching from the Baal Shem Tov based on a verse in the Psalms. It says, "La'olam Hashem dvarcha nitzav v'shamayim." The verse says, God's utterances. I think this translation is off. I copy pasted it, but God's utterances. Let me see if I have it here still. I don't. God's utterances were. I'm going to read it in Hebrew. God's utterances stand in heaven. So not only did God speak and create through his speech, but his speech, the words of his speech, the letters of his speech, they are still in heaven. O Pirish Baal Shem Tov Zechron Levracha, the Baal Shem Tov explained, Ki dvarcha shamarti here at Kibbutz Echamayim, your words which you utter, let there be a firmament in the midst of the waters. Tevas va'osis elu nitzavos va'onis la'olam b'seir charkia. These words and letters through which the heavens were created stand firmly forever within the firmament of heaven.
Wow.
And these words are forever clothed within the heavens to give them life. So I'm gonna explain the rest of what he says outside, but this is what he explains. He says that God spoke, that created letters, and the letters are actually behind the creation of the world. Deep inside, the spiritual energy in every letter, in every existence in the world is God's words. There's letters, right? They're not physical letters, they're spiritual letters and words, but those spiritual words are behind everything in the world, and they stay constantly. The Baal Shem Tov continues and he says that King David said they stay constantly. If those letters would stop existing, then whatever they created would also cease to exist.
Oh,
So
wow.
basically, those letters are actually constantly creating everything in the world. Everything in the world has letters in it from God. And those letters are constantly creating. So, I mean, the Rebbe spoke many times and he said, when you know that God is constantly creating the world and God didn't create the world and let go, he didn't throw a bowling ball, right? He's constantly creating the world and everything is constantly under his supervision. That can sometimes ease your anxiety. You know that God's always paying attention. He's always in charge. He always has a plan. Everything is constantly created. That's one thing we can learn. So God's words are constantly creating the world. When someone says, oh my God, I screwed up. Actually, the results of what you did were just created right now, right? You didn't cause it to happen. It was just created actively by God. So every detail in the world is being created at the present moment. It's being recreated. This is one thing that the Baal Shem Tov taught from King David's words. So that's point number one. Everything in the world has letters from God's speech, utterances from God's speech, creating it constantly. Now, here is the next lesson that the Alter Rebbe says in the book we just quoted. He says, okay, so we said God created the world with his words. So this computer that I'm talking to right now is being created by God's words. All right, where do I see that God said, let there be a computer in the Torah? Right? You got the question? Yeah. Where do I see all the details in the world? There's only 10 utterances, and we say that God created the world with 10 utterances. So some commentaries want to say, no, you got big things and small things, you know? You got the world, you got the planet. So God created the planet. You got a species of animals. He created one species and it evolved and gave birth to other animals. But the Arizal gives a beautiful explanation. He says, when you take those words in the Torah, in studying Torah, there are many ways to approach letters. Every letter has a numerical value. Every letter has different letters that can be switched in certain contexts. There's many, many, many layers. He actually says there's 231 gates for letters to shift and everything like that. So, that's one of the reasons why a Jewish name is so important. In Jewish tradition, when someone's sick, sometimes we add a name to it, a name which promotes health or life, right? The reason is because everything gets energy for the Hebrew word that stands behind it. And that Hebrew word shifts through all different types of filters that God has, because the Hebrew letters in the alphabet They work through many, many different types of filters and explanations, numerical value, et cetera, alternative spellings. Each letter has a different way that it could be spelled, right? So those filters take each letter and filter it down into each creation. So when you pick up a rock from the ground, that rock actually has godly voice and godly letters inside of it, creating it right now. And that's every single detail in the world. It's mind-boggling to think that way. So on a greater scale, the Hebrew name for something is not just a name that created, it's not just a name which represents something, but it's actually the letters from God's voice which give energy to that thing. I'll give you another example. There's an interesting, very interesting story in the Midrash. It says that God created Adam. What happened when God created Adam? Adam didn't get along with the angels so well, right? Adam didn't get along with the angels so well, or rather the angels didn't get along with him. They said, God, you made this guy. He only has 2 hands. He's like so disgusting. He's finite, right? He needs to consume things to survive. He's physical, right? He's so defined physically. So God turns to the angels and he says, okay, guys, I want you guys to name the animals. So the angels try to name the animals and they can't do it. They can't name the animals. They see a bear, a donkey, a lion, a dinosaur, whatever animals there were then. They can't do it. So God turns to Adam and says, okay, Adam, you name the animals. So Adam goes and he looks at each animal and he says, oh, this is an aryeh. Aryeh means a lion. This is a dove. A dove means a bear. This is a par. A par means a cow. This is a shor, a bull, right? And he says all the Hebrew names of all the animals. And the angels look at God and they say, wow, this guy is not bad, not bad. Bravo. So the commentaries ask, what is such a big deal? I mean, my youngest kids, I mean, not my baby, but Shoshana could go make up names for animals, right? They do it all the time. Any adult could, any name. I mean, you're the first one to make up names. You can go make up any name you want. What is such a big deal? Why are the angels not able to do it? Why is Adam able to do it? And why are the angels so impressed with Adam that they fold and they say, okay, God, okay, we get the point. Adam's really good. So the commentaries explain that Adam was not just thinking of names to discern between animals. Adam was looking at each animal, and Adam had the skill that he was able to see God's words inside the animal. Adam was very holy. He was able to see what words, what letters created each animal. So when Adam said, oh, this is a lion is an aryeh, he actually saw the letters Aleph, Resh, Yud, and a Hey in the aryeh, which create the animal. And that's what the angels were so impressed about. They said, we're not able to see God's letters from God's voice in all the God's sayings in all the creatures, but Adam is very great. So going back, that's actually the importance of a Jewish name. A secular name, or any name really, is there for the purpose to discern between people. If there was only one person in the world, he wouldn't need a name, right? He wouldn't need a name. When there are 2 people, then they need names. When there are 3 people, right? And if you go to any Chabad synagogue and you say the name Mendel, right?
Yeah, a lot of Mendel.
Many people will answer. So sometimes you have to, sometimes by habit in a lot of Jewish schools, even from a young age, it's really cute. They call each other by last names because a lot of them have similar names. So the Hebrew name, so a regular name is just to discern between 2 things. A Hebrew name is actually the energy which God puts in that thing and plants in that thing constantly. He gives constant energy to that thing. All right. So that is how letters work. Now, letters are also a revelation of God, right? Think about it like this. You may think and have an idea, but if you want to explain it, you have to put it in letters, right? You have to put it in letters. Letters, they are able to, it actually calls, in Psalms, it calls letters, they're like buildings. Each letter is like a building, and
No.
they create a city, right? You have this building next to that building. So you take a letter next to another letter, it creates a word, right? And then a word helps create a sentence, paragraph, and a paragraph comes to express ideas. Letters are, generally speaking, revelations of God. So God is revealed in every creature. Everything in the world has God revealed in it, and many different ways. And there's actually many books in the Torah and the Talmud and stuff like that, where they'll go and they'll take a name of someone and they'll show that if you flip this letter with that and exchange it, there's many ways of exchanging letters with each other. You actually can find a subliminal message in the Torah of something else it's trying to say. These are usually in the Kabbalistic circles of the Torah. So letters are revelations, and letters go through all sorts of filters in order to be divided up, categorized, and express something. Nowadays, sometimes you can think something and realize that someone else totally thinks differently than you. And then you'll say something and they will totally misunderstand you, right? They'll totally misunderstand you, and they're talking on such a different plane. And it's a great skill in order to put your letters together and words together and masterfully put them together and express an idea and give someone else a new perspective that perhaps you have and they didn't have, right? So that is how the 10 utterances that we spoke about in the Torah work. God said 10 utterances, and all those letters mix up and they go into all sorts of codes, and all sorts of those codes go up and create every creation. So here's just sum up what the Baal Shem Tov taught there. God said 10 utterances. Those 10 utterances are not a one-time thing. They're constant. They're constant. Everything that exists in the world has godly letters, the Hebrew letters in it of God, right? And we said before, we asked, why does God need a language? Because that is how he chose to create. He chose to create by using a language, creating a language and using it. Every creation in the world has those letters. And it's not only every general category has godly words in it, but actually every physical particle and atom actually has godly words inside of it. And you can't see them. We don't have microscopes to see them yet. But one of the things that it says when Mashiach comes, Isaiah says, he says, V'ra'u kol basar yachtav. Our flesh will actually finally be able to see God's words, right? We'll actually finally be able to see God's words in everything. And that's why Mashiach will be so blissful. We will be able to see God behind everything and the reason for everything, because we will actually see God's speech behind everything. Now, one more example of this, and then we will go back and take it back to the Aleph Bet. So the Torah says, Lo ala lechem levado yichya ha'adam, ki im al moitze pi havaya shevalechem. It says, a man does not only live from bread, he lives from God's word.
Word that comes
Right, God's word, right? It comes from God's words. Now, so this is a very interesting interpretation. Now, did anyone ever ask a question? Why is it that humans need to eat?
That's
right?
a good question.
Now, you'll say to get energy, but why do we need food to get energy? Or why do we need specific nutritious foods to get energy? I mean, of course, that's just the way it is, but why is it indeed that way? What exactly is going on, right? What exactly is going on that we need to eat nutritious foods to survive? Jerry, do you have an answer?
Not entirely.
So that's just the way it is, right? That's the way it is. We take it for granted. I mean, presumably Adam, I don't know, Adam had a little different, but probably at some point in history, there were some humans and they were like hungry and they had this instinct. They took like some dirt and put it in their mouth and like, and took a rock and broke their, right? And they kept trying things. One of the most incredible things that I always kind of was intrigued by is olives. You ever had a raw olive? It's so bitter, it's impossible to eat, right? Some guy was like, oh, disgusting. Okay, let's put it in salt and brine and let it sit and everything like that. Okay, now it's good, right? How do you figure that out? Okay, so here's what the Torah says. The Torah says we don't only survive from food, we also survive from God's word. The great Arizal gave an interpretation. He said, what does it mean we survive from God's word? We survive from God's words, which are inside the bread. When we eat bread, it's not just a chemical combination where the nutrition is absorbed in our body. God's word is inside the bread, and our body needs to have a connection with God. So when we eat the bread, we're actually consuming the spiritual energy inside the bread. We're consuming the spiritual energy, which gives the bread the nutrition to give us life. So now let me just explain it a little bit more. We all have souls and bodies, right? When we're born, the soul comes into our body. When we die, the soul leaves our body. The body is complete, 100% full, oftentimes 100% healthy, but the soul is gone. When we eat food, God's word, essentially when we get sick or we're tired or we're sleeping, our soul leaves our body a little bit. Our soul leaves our body a little bit, right? So we're dizzy because our soul is not fully enclosed and implanted in our body. When we eat food, what it does is it connects our soul back in our body. God's words inside the bread, that energy which works through the nutrition, comes and puts our soul back in our body. So this is just an example of where we see that really God spoke at the creation of the world, and those words are found in everything. Those words are found in everything. There's a lot of beautiful paintings about this idea. It's very hard to see these words. I personally do not see them so well, but if you learn the second book of the Tanya, it gives us an inkling of what it means and how things in the world work. So now let's go back to the Aleph base. Now, I'm going to share the screen of the Aleph base, and you will see this, and we'll understand what our question was. What was the significance of 280? Okay. Any questions so far?
Nope. Rabbi,
Yes.
how are the different values attached to each letter?
All right. So each letter, now again, when we're talking about English letters, or any other language, Latin, any other language, any ancient language, which is actually interesting because a lot of the ancient languages have similarities to Hebrew, which I'll explain in a moment. I was once reading somewhere, it said, why do Jews obsess with praying in Hebrew? You could pray in English according to Jewish law. Now, I was talking to someone recently. I was putting up mezuzah somewhere, and someone asked me, they said, why does the mezuzah need to be in English, in Hebrew? And it's not kosher in English. So I told them, I said, well, if it would have been in the languages of the Jewish people, we wouldn't have any mezuzah left. Now that you have a Hebrew mezuzah on your door, you're a carrier of mezuzahs. You're a carrier of mezuzahs, right? You are doing the exact same thing that they did for 4,000 years. When you hear the Megillah in Hebrew, you are a carrier of the Megillah. You have taken the Megillah and you have let it enter your reality in Hebrew, in ancient Hebrew, and now you are passing it on. The Megillah has reached you. So now in Hebrew, one of the interesting things about Hebrew and any ancient language is words have a lot of dual meaning. As time goes on in English, there's more and more words. This year I learned a new word called woke, right? I was trying to find, what does it mean? I see everywhere it says, as time goes on, more words are added, more meanings are added. Hebrew and ancient languages have a finite amount of words, and words have a lot of significance. They have a lot of dual meaning. That's one level of Hebrew and Hebrew letters and stuff like that. But that's as far as the words go. So when you read a word, when you're praying in Hebrew, it doesn't just have the simple meaning which you would read in English, but it also has implied meanings on all sorts of levels and spiritual levels that we can't even imagine. Now, each letter in Hebrew, because it's created by God and it's God's language, it's like loaded with infinite energy. That's why God's words could create. But let's say Aleph is 1. There's a numerical system in the letters. Aleph 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 20, 30, 40, 50, 60, 70, 80, 90, 100, 200, 300, 400. You have a numerical value to each letter. Furthermore, each letter has a spelling. I'll give you an example. Aleph makes the ah sound, right? Anyone who's been to the Hebrew classes here, they know Aleph makes the ah sound. But how do you spell Aleph? Well, the way you spell Aleph is Aleph Lamed, Fe, right? That's how you spell Aleph. You see that? How do you spell Bet? Bet, right? Bet is spelled Beis Yud. I'm just putting this thing so you can just see it's the left. Bet is spelled Beis Yud Taf, right? I'm sorry. Beis Yud Taf. Now, Aleph has a numerical value as 1. Aleph also means the master, right? Who's the master? God, right? So the God, one God, right? There's all this incredible meaning. Then you have the numerical value of how you spell Aleph. Aleph, numerical value is Aleph 31, right? This is 31, and this is 101, right? 101 represents another Kabbalistic level. Then you have different ways of spelling Aleph. You have different ways of spelling Aleph. Here's another way of spelling Aleph. Here, Aleph, like that, right? So you have tons of value, right? And then Aleph stands for other things, right? It stands for other things. Now, take Bet. Bet's numerical value is, anyone know what it is? 2. Bet is 2. 2. Now Bet, if you spell it out, what does it read? Bayit. Bayit means home.
Home.
Right? Now, Bet is also the first word of the Torah, which is Bereshit, the creation. Bet represents the second thing. What was the second thing? The first thing is God. The second thing is the world. That's the first creation, the universe, the spiritual universe. So Bet is the home of God. It's number 2. It's the second thing. Now, this also has a numerical value. It's 410. And all these things are super connected, layers on layers. I'm talking infinite. In Jewish tradition, it says, Rambam says, it's Arucha Me'eretz Mida. There is infinite amount of interpretation in these words and codes and how to do it. I just did a little bit. I could really.
Is it 412, Rabbi?
This is
Did I get it
412.
wrong?
412,
Yeah.
correct.
You said
412.
410. Okay.
But, you know, there's different ways of spelling it. Sometimes Bet is spelled with 2 yuds, or sometimes Bet is spelled like that, right? So these are all in the words are tons of codes that we find in the Torah. So throughout the Torah, actually, in Jewish tradition, the Torah, the words of the Torah, actually everything is hinted in the Torah. Now, when you get into the Torah words, it gets even more complex. In the Torah, you have the shapes of the letters. The shapes all have a representation. You also have, let me just show you something here. I'll insert something. You have in the Torah words, you have crowns, right? And the crowns all represent something, and the shapes all represent something, right? So these are all, you know, like for example, the Alter Rebbe, when he one time hired a chassid to teach his kids. So famously, the teacher said, "How am I going to teach the Rebbe's kids?" You know, it's like imagine if the greatest doctor hires a young doctor to do his research. It's like, how is he going to do that? You know? So the Alter Rebbe actually, he asked, the teacher asked him, he said, how do I teach him? So he said, the first thing is you have to teach the shape of the letters. And famously, and this is kind of beautiful, the Alter Rebbe, the first Chabad Rebbe in the 1700s, were talking a tune, but this was passed down. The Rebbe said the story many times. We even know the same tune he said it. He said, Vas is an Aleph. What is an Aleph? A pin to lefanayben, a pin to lefanuntin. Das is an Aleph. Aleph has a little dot on top, a dot on the bottom, a yud on top, a yud on the bottom, and a kav be'emta, and a line in the middle. And the Alter Rebbe explained, he said the foundation of Judaism is to know that there's the soul above, there's the soul below, and there's this line in the middle that we're connected through that. And that's our mission, and that's the foundation of our mission in the world. So that is every letter has so much symbolism. So I'm gonna, there's so much we could talk about that. And it's actually incredible. You know, there were, you know, everyone has a name that they were given, and your name was actually given with, when you're born, your name is given with divine prophecy. That's what our Rizal says. And your name is actually the letters which give you energy. Okay. So now here we have the main letters, and then we have the final letters. Menatzpach, right? Menatzpach It's a kind of a word in a verse, which happens to spell all these things. These are the final letters. Now, when the final letters were revealed by prophets, because again, most Jewish people, they didn't write in the divine Hebrew. They wrote in ancient Hebrew. There's ancient Hebrew, which is triangular, or we have script nowadays, Rochelle, right? And then there's the
Yes.
old Hebrew, which is like boxed letters. It's called Ashurit. Jerry, I know this is funny, but 4 years ago, we studied about this in the Talmud on the second page of Megillah. Okay. So anyways.
I remember that, Rabbi.
Yeah. Okay. So anyways, here you have these letters here. These are the end letters. Now, in the first tablets were written in this font, right? We said the first tablets were written in this font. Now, Torahs were not written in the same font we have today until about 2,500 years ago. What happened is because it wasn't written in the proper font, there were forgeries, there were mistakes. Jews were assimilating. They were kicked out of Israel. They were assimilating. They were writing it wrong. So Ezra, the scribe, there was a great scribe, the prophet at that time, Ezra. He said, from now on, all Torahs have to be a copy of my Torahs. And if not, they are not kosher. And he said that because he knew that is the only way, only way to keep the Torah for till today is if it stays precisely in the same shape of letters that he has. Besides that, so he said, in other words, even though typically regular people don't write in this divine font, even the Torah, from now on, the Torah will be written in this divine font, because if not, we will lose it. We will lose it all. And look, we still have it today, right? So this font over here is divine. It's very, very holy. The Rebbe was of the opinion that if you're making a flyer that says women's paint night or whatever it is, you should not, and you want to write in Hebrew, you should not use this font. Keep this font for the Torah. Right? You shouldn't use it for mundane things. So in the first, we said the first tablets had this font. The second tablets did not have this font. Now, one of the things is if you look at this mem here, in the first tablets, it was engraved, the letters were engraved all the way through. Right? So it says in the Talmud that in the first tablets, the mem, the shlas mem we call in Yiddish, this closed mem, which is a final letter, it says, how was this mem exist? It says, well, the center part floated miraculously. Right? The center part, it was a miracle. The center part floated miraculously. You got that?
Mhm.
Okay. So now we're going to talk about the difference between these letters and these letters. Now, first of all, the Midrash says that the final letters, they all hint out to, they're called the oisius kufulais, the double letters, right? These ones are all a double of their main letter. They all hint out to famous people. Chaf hints out to Abraham, because the Torah says lech lecha, uses a double, two chafs. Mem is Isaac, because it says ki etzamta mimenu ma'od. It means the Jewish people will be strong in both worlds. Nun refers to Jacob. Jacob says hatzileni na. He says, save me from my brother Esav. There's these two nuns. That signifies that Jacob will always be saved in both worlds. Pei refers to Moshe. Moshe says, pakad pakadati eschem, and Tzaddik refers to Mashiach. It says, semach Tzaddik or malach melech. Mashiach will, a righteous person will grow, right? So this is referring to Mashiach. So these letters all refer to some great people, and they all refer to some double significance. Now, let me tell you the next thing. In the world, there's God and every person. We have two main emotions. One is called chesed. Chesed means kindness. And the other is called gevura. Gevura literally means strength, right? This is very interesting. Now, huh?
Or bravery, perhaps?
Well, so gevura literally means strength. Right?
Literally, okay.
But as a result of its strength, it actually signifies a lot of different things. In general, gevura, chesed means to give and to connect. And gevura means to withhold, to be strict, to be strong, right? So there's many ways that someone is strong, right? Chesed means to give and connect. Actually, the right hand is considered the chesed hand. It's giving, it's warm, it's connecting. Gevura often refers to being strict, right? Sometimes you have to be strict on someone else. You have to be judgmental sometimes, right? You have to judge someone. You have to protect yourself. You have to be, as Rochelle said, brave, courageous. That is gevura. They're both important, right? Now, chesed in God's realm means revelation. God reveals himself. When God reveals himself, it blows everything out of the park because only God exists. In order to create a world, there had to be gvura. God had to withhold his revelation, right? It's like, sometimes some women tonight are going to paint, right? When you're painting, you have an idea. Sometimes you have to withhold your idea in order to zoom in and to kind of take apart what you really want. That's gvura. A lot of times when you're giving, sometimes you need to
You stop it.
A lot of times you have to withhold to give precisely. Everyone gets the idea. So you have chesed and gvura. Chesed means to give freely. Gvura means to be strict, to withhold, oftentimes to give. Now, the letters are God's revelation. They're God's speech. God creates with them. He reveals himself with letters. And that's how we reveal ourselves also, with speech, right? That's how we reveal ourselves with our image. That's how we reveal ourselves. Gvura is God withholding. So you have these letters here. They make words. And then you have these letters here. What do they do? What do the final letters do? They end words. They end revelation. That's what they do, right? The final letters, they stop the word. When you put a final letter, the word's over. It ends the revelation. So these worlds create, and these worlds kind of define the creation. Because when you end something, now you can define it. If a word goes on forever, right? Sometimes kids, they come to the keyboard and they hold the letter down, right? And it just goes on and on. These words, they end the word. They define, they confine, they define what you're trying to say. So these words are called the words of chesed, the words of God's giving, letters of God's giving, and these are the letters of God holding back, defining, right?
Oh.
That's menatzpach. Menatzpach defines. Now, at first, we'll say, what's better, chesed or gvura? Chesed or gvura? Well, they both have advantages. Chesed is giving and it's warm, but sometimes in order to create a relationship, you need gvura. Sometimes you need to, if let's say a lady comes to her husband and says, "Wow, you love me so much," and he says, "Yeah, I love everybody so much," right? Imagine how the wife would feel, right? Right? Gvura, sometimes that's to create a boundary. I have a special relationship with you. I give to you because this is important to me, because you are important to me, right? If you have too much chesed, sometimes it's a problem. Sometimes you can't actually give as much if you give too much, right? You have to know what you can give, what you can't give, how you can give. Furthermore, and actually one of the qualities of gvura is gvura can sometimes we know sometimes it's really easy to say yes and it's hard to say no. Gvura takes strength. To say no takes strength. But when someone has a lot of gvura and they decide to give and they decide to yes, sometimes they fight for it and they actually give much more than chesed, right? When someone is using their inner strength to give, they give much more. They give much stronger, right? That's why actually we call rain, there's rain, and then there's gvurot geshamim, strong rains, right? Strong doesn't always mean to say no. Just because you know how to say no doesn't mean you should always say no. But you know what it means? It means when you say yes, that means something. That's a good yes. You're really going to commit to it. So in order to create the world, God had to reveal himself, but he also had to confine creations. Every creation has its own energy, its own entity, its own shape, its own characteristics. That's what the final letters do. Menatzpach. So we take the numerical value of these letters and you have a similar thing. What was the numerical value? Anyone remember?
280.
280. Very good.
How about-
280 is the numerical value of the final letters. You come over here to the Mishkan, and the fence around the Mishkan is the numerical value of 280. The same amount as the final letters. Why is that? Because the Mishkan is where God's divine creation is, right? God's divine revelation is. As we said before, it used to be every day in the Mishkan. Fire came down literally from heaven to consume the offerings. Furthermore, if you would go into the Holy of Holies, it says, if you would measure how big the ark is and how big the poles are, and then you'd measure the room, it actually wouldn't fit. It didn't make sense. It was a paradoxical room. This is where God was revealed, because God is able to make the greatest paradoxes. This is where God revealed. This is God's home in the world. And in the Temple of Jerusalem is even stronger. That was God's home. However, there was a fence of 280 around it. 280 is benatzpach. That's the defining factor. If you want to transform the world, you can't just have God revealing himself, because then the world will no longer be a world. It'll be overpowered, right? The world, if you go to someone, and sometimes there were people who went to the Rebbe and they disagreed with the Rebbe, but he was such an overbearing, righteous person, they instantly changed their mind, right? But then when they left, their mind changed back. And Yom Kippur is such a holy day. We make so many resolutions. We feel so good spiritually, right? But the day after Yom Kippur, sometimes we forget what we decided to do. Sometimes we forget how it felt. So in the temple, God was super tangibly present. Outside, God is not. Our job is to take the mishkan and bring it out. How do we do it? Sometimes we have to make it bite-sized. Sometimes we have to explain it. Sometimes we have to go through the struggle of the struggle of revealing it in outside places. That's what this wall represents. This wall represents the complete revelation. That's why it was 280. It was the final letters, right? The final letters, they stop each word, they define each thing. Because when things are limited and defined, infinite is good. But our job is to reveal infinite in the finite, in the world as we know it. And the only way we can do it sometimes is by going to each place specifically, and by revealing it in a bite-sized matter, by realizing in our own. Sometimes people tell me, they say, "Oh, Rabbi, I wish I was educated with more Judaism when I was younger." But what they don't realize is their job is actually to bring it to the place where they are when they're older, the exact place, to bring God to that exact place. We don't want to overpower it. Sometimes we need gevura. Sometimes you need to hold back in order to bring it in every nitty-gritty place in the world. So that's what the significance of 280 is. It actually says, one of the interesting things it says is the menatzpach. The final letters, the double letters, they refer to the redemption. They refer to the coming of Mashiach, because when Mashiach comes, God will be fully revealed in every finite place in the world. This is a very big foundation in Judaism. And Judaism isn't about the general idea of knowing about God, about believing God. It's about taking God to every specific place in the world. When you have tefillin, for example, you got to take a cow. The cow's got to be slaughtered. You got to take the skin. You got to work the skin, paint it, build it, do this, write that, every little detail of the words, right? That's the chesed, the kindness of God, the revelation of God coming into the finite parts of the world. So that is the significance of 280, the fence of the Mishkan. The fence of the Mishkan was in order that the Mishkan's energy should filter out in the Jewish people. It should enter their daily lives. And it shouldn't just be that people feel holy only when they're in a holy place, but it should enter their daily lives and enter every detail of our lives, what we eat, what we do, how we spend our days. So that is a Torah, based on a Torah of the Rebbe's father, Rabbi Levi Yitzchak. He passed away in Almaty, Kazakhstan. He was very much abused by the Russian government, but he wrote a lot of these Torahs while he was there. In the margins of his books, he didn't have paper. He barely had ink. His wife made ink out of different things that she found there so he could write his Torah. And not only that, but a lot of the things that he wrote are in like different color inks in the margin of the page. And that's what that's basically, one of the things he did, but his Torahs are truly, truly incredible. So that is for today. We'll see all the women joining tonight. If you want to come, Crystal and Myra, we still have paint sets. If painting is not your thing, that's cool. There's actually a lot of women joining, so it looks really exciting.
Thank you.
Thank you, Rabbi. Very interesting.
Thank you.
All right.
Yeah.
Wow. That was really something.
All right. Take care.